Today on the Perception and Action podcast, my interview with Otto, Lappi, and Alan Dove, authors of the new book, The Science of the Racer's Brain. What makes a skilled racing driver? How can we better design practice in racing? So it's time for a call to action. Hi, this is Rob Gray from Arizona State University. I've been on a now over 25-year journey as a researcher, professor, and high-performance consultant to understand how we acquire and adapt our perceptual motor skills. Welcome to the Perception and Action podcast, where I discuss how psychological research can be applied to improving performance, accelerating skill acquisition, and designing technologies. Before we get to today's topic, I want to tell you about my new book. Yes, I've written a new book on skill acquisition called How We Learn to Move, a revolution in the way we coach and practice sports skills. It covers the ecological approach to skill from different angles, including practice design, the CLA, coaching, youth sports, designing technology, injury prevention, and using analytics. So I hope you will consider giving it a read. You can find the book on Amazon or by going to perceptionaction.com/book. Now on to the show. So today my guests are Otto and Alan, authors of the new book, The Science of the Racer's Brain. Thanks for joining me, guys.
Thanks for having us on.
Okay, so to start off with, I think I'll get you to tell us a little bit about your background. So maybe, Alan, we could start with you.
I'll try and keep it as short as possible, but because I have I guess, an eclectic background, so I'll try and keep it as motorsport focused as possible. But my brother started karting when he was very young. I was born into the sport, I guess, the sport of kart racing. If you're familiar with motorsport, it's kind of the foundation of our entire sort of industry. So I started kart racing at 8. I was lucky enough to race Lewis Hamilton at club level. Obviously, he's now in Formula One, a world champion, and I'm not. So you can guess that there was a big difference in performance there. But I retired. I didn't retire. We stopped karting when I was about 13. It's an expensive sport, as you can imagine. Then I sort of got back into motorsport in my early 20s, primarily because my brother, he was a more successful driver than I was. He did driver coaching, got into kart driver coaching. It's something he fancied. I mean, he's actually written a book as well, Master the Art of Kart Racing. And I sort of got into the sport from being a competitor to being an observer, someone that helped him coach drivers. I then started a media-based platform for kart racing. And from there, that sort of was my kind of slide back into the sport and interacting with it. I then progressed, got interviewing people, driving karts, having fun, living a fun life. I ended up coaching car races because a friend of mine had a simulator center. And then from there, I got more into the car racing thing. And maybe it was insecurity. I felt like my knowledge base wasn't sufficient in what I was teaching people. It was very much a case of a bit ad hoc coaching methods, as the sport kind of is, motorsport. It's not as formal as I've listened to your podcast, and I know you develop practice techniques and regimes for people. And in motorsport, it's not quite as rigid as that. And then that sort of led me into the scientific world, reading scientific journals. And obviously Otto, and this was like 2016, it was a name that just kept popping up because eye tracking is such a big thing in motorsport, because it's something that you can kind of observe and try and say to a driver, well, this is what a good driver does. And you can show him a video of it, and it's very obvious. It's easy to show. And so Otto's name popped up, and I threw an email his way, and that's how we got sort of communicating. And then I can let Otto tell you his background. I hope that was the succinct.
No, that was fine. No, I think you guys are a good mix of authors. So Otto, can you tell us a little bit about your background?
I'll pick it up from there. So by the time Alan's email came through, I was running my lab here at Helsinki. So I'm a cognitive scientist, and I did my PhD in cognitive science 10 years ago on eye tracking car drivers. So we do field experiments in real cars, not race cars, unfortunately, so far. Hoping to change that, maybe with this book. Eye tracking in real cars, simulators, and also lab experiments, trying to expand the ecological range of trying to understand how humans use gaze, especially in visual guidance and moving about. Most of the research that you'll find on eye tracking drivers in the academic literature is really on everyday driving and not high performance driving, not race driving. And that's something that's always interested me theoretically and also practically. I don't have a driving background. I did some, like what you would nowadays call sim racing back in the day when I was an undergraduate student. And while I was an undergraduate student doing cognitive science and neuropsychology courses, I would always refer back to the problem of, well, how do these cognitive processes, how does this motor control, how do these perceptual processes relate to the fundamental problem of taking a vehicle through a bend at a very high speed. So already during then, I was kind of thinking about this particular domain for whatever personal reasons I don't know and will not go into, but for some reason it has always fascinated me. So I was kind of primed for this question or this topic. But we're hoping that more people will come out and kind of come out of the closet that they also find this topic fascinating, because there's really very little out there, very little in the academic research, and also no books like this that would bring together like what is known about expert performance and the brains and cognitive processes of human experts and how we can understand high-speed driving or racing from this point of view.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good way, and that's a good way to set up kind of I wanted to start with kind of the motivation, and you set up nicely in the preface to the book that maybe this is not quite what everyone is expecting when they pick up this book, because I think you're doing my favorite combination of doing applied work that addresses a real life thing, but also using it to advance theory in our basic understanding of perception and motor control. So maybe I'll start with you, Otto, this time. Can you tell us a little bit about kind of what you're trying to achieve and your motivation? You did a little bit already, but maybe just kind of follow on that. Yeah.
Well, basically what we try to do is break down the skill sets of the racing driver. We don't assume any technical knowledge or background in racing and racing terminology in the book. We start from basic principles and describe the techniques and what racing is about to the extent that is required. We break down the skills and then ask the question, well, what cognitive processes do you need to execute such skills? What cognitive capacities do you need to develop to do this at a very high level? And then the follow-up question, it being the racer's brain, well, what brain mechanisms or what parts of the brain would be responsible for those cognitive processes? Of course, we can't rely on a huge amount of data because we are hoping that people will be inspired and start collecting data on this, so that when we do a follow-up book, there will be more research existing on this topic. But that's the basic idea: break down the skills and then look at them from a cognitive science point of view, which is something new, which people haven't done in the literature before.
Yeah, I think you definitely bring that across, and I like the idea. I've always thought not only is thing like racing. My example is baseball batting. Like I like studying. The most interesting way to study perception cognition to me is when it's being pushed to its absolute maximum, which is obviously driving is an example of like, you can't get much more demanding than that on our perceptual motor system. So Alan, do you have anything to add, like of kind of your motivations when you emailed Otto, kind of what, from your background, what we were kind of hoping to achieve with this book?
Um, for me personally, the I guess the beginnings of this idea about writing a book, I'd actually jotted down some ideas for writing a book kind of before the time I was emailing Otto, but I found what I was writing was sort of not very substantial. It was very flimsy. I was trying to write it in a sense, in a similar way to other things that have been written, and I just felt like I was lacking a real scientific base for what I was saying. It was more like a how-to book, but I found myself veering into questions of. I veered away. I found myself veering away from teaching people to understanding them. And when I was coaching drivers, and I would coach drivers mainly in the car racing world in a sim environment, and that's something I guess you might want to expand upon. I don't know. I can't. But whatever. Sorry. And with driving, we have a very unique situation where we have simulators that are very similar to the real thing. And I can't think of many other sports where you can simulate to such a high level. So I worked in, I hope that makes sense in that in other sports, you don't have a sim for football. You don't have a simulator for golf. You can have, I guess, golf centers and stuff like that, but the actual action of a simulator, I guess that's, so I was working in that sort of realm. But anyway, to get back to my point, I'm deviating a bit here, that I was just dissatisfied with my own level of knowledge. And that was and I felt when I was coaching people, I wasn't 100% secure with what I was teaching, and a lot of people would come to me and they would ask me questions like, where do I need to look? Where should I've heard about people looking far ahead. And I could say, well, you need to look at the apex and you need to look at the exit and you need to look down the road. But it was sort of very empty kind of words where I was just reciting kind of what I'd seen on eye trackers, and it didn't seem to mean much. So that was my sort of inner motivation. I wanted to have, it was almost selfish. I wanted to have something to read where I could go, now this is the level of knowledge. This is the level of discussion where I'm more comfortable, because I'd end up reading studies, and I guess I would, even if it was unrelated to driving, I was always trying to look for connections, relevant connections to race driving, where someone might have picked up on something, here or here. I was just trying to find something that would just give me more, I don't know what the word would be, just more self-confidence in what I was teaching people. And in the end, I just felt like maybe the teaching thing I should put aside and focus on the expanding the knowledge thing, because I think overall that would be a more valid thing to do. Because I think building the knowledge base, especially since driving has simulators, so it's studyable in a way that is kind of very accessible, particularly if you're studying IE strategies and stuff like that. So yeah, the motivation for me was, I just felt dissatisfied with myself. I didn't feel like there was a lot of literature out there, similar with Otto, that seemed to serve the subject. And that was it. That's what got me going.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. I can sympathize with that a little in my career as well. The scientific finding, like you look at the tangent point to go around a curve, is one thing. What do you actually do with that? to get a driver to do that is a hugely other big step that we sometimes take for granted. So I think making that,
I mean, just a specific on that point. Just as I wanted to say, one of the things in terms of study that Otto referred to in inspiring study is there is iZone is a training facility in England at Silverstone, and one of their things is eye tracking, and they do a lot of work with eye tracking. And one of the things, so this has been going on for quite a long time, but one of the areas of interest that I sort of developed was, you can go online and you can see like little things on F1 shows, and they do an eye tracking thing, and they say top class drivers, they look further down the road. And I always felt the big gap was no one's really studied how a novice driver learns and how their gaze works as they develop and learn a circuit. So it's like you're teaching people how to copy a top level driver, but there's a massive gap in between that and a novice. say there was no steps. It was, this is what the top driver does, because you can do it with data as well. You can look at where they brake, where they accelerate, where they steer, but there's no intermediary. And that sort of deficit is partially because of the lack of scientific interest in the subject, because we all look at the very top experts, take the data, and it's like, we'll just copy them. And it's like, well, there's a big deficit here of scientific knowledge. And that was
data. Sorry. So one of the, like, I think scientifically very good properties of studying driving or racing driver is precisely what Alan brought up, that you can simulate it to various degrees. So you can have a very simple driving simulator, really pared back perceptual psychology experiment with just a basic steering task and full control of what you are presenting the participant. And then you can add layers, more realistic handling, more realistic scenarios, up to like modern simulators that are really very close to the real thing in terms of the scanning of the racetrack, and also the tire models and the dynamics of the vehicle and the skills you need to develop to actually control a simulated vehicle or a sim racing vehicle as a high level. And then, of course, you can take it to the real world as well as to do eye tracking or physiology in real cars. So you can span that whole range in quite a unique way in terms of the instrumentation and availability of equipment, but also the data analysis procedures and understanding telemetry and what kind of telemetry comes out of the vehicle and how that relates to performance as it's analyzed in vehicle performance and dynamics engineering. So you got all this basis, even if you're not fully interested in driving as such, then as an opportunity to a domain where you can pose these questions at the full range from simple representative tasks to the full ecological conditions is quite unique. And also then in terms of understanding the human performance, like you can say that, okay, swinging a baseball bat, so that's, some people would look at it quite constrained task. It's a very closed, and you are standing in one place and you are swinging a bat with 60 degrees of freedom. And you can say that, okay, a racetrack is a much more complicated 3D environment and so on. Well, that is true. But on the other hand, the vehicle is only controlled by a couple of degrees of freedom. So the steering wheel and two pedals ultimately. So you have a quite low dimensional system through which all the motor processes and all the skill of the driver have to come through, so you can understand it more. You don't have to look at all the biophysics and all the musculature and all the, well, you will eventually, but you don't have to at first understand all the complex biophysics of the human body to be able to look at nuanced questions of performance, because it's all mediated by the vehicle,
right,
which is more understood than the human body, because the vehicle is, of course, engineered and designed by humans.
Yeah. No way. You know the vehicle dynamics, and you can vary those too if you really want to. And yeah. No, I think that you're making a really good point about the simulation and I think of the classic like Mike Land's famous work, where it was just like two little strips of the road in a very, very low fidelity simulator, and all the stuff he found out of that, and going all the way up to the what we have now, where you can do much more realistic. You're right, we can do anything in between, really. It's amazing.
You mentioned the tangent point, and you don't want me to go on a tangent on that, because I actually did my PhD on the tangent point orientation and the different kinds of visual strategies that you could actually have underneath. Because if you look at the original data, it's like the field data from the Jaguar drives on Queen's Road in Belfast, I think.
Arthur's seat,
Arthur's seat, yeah. So actually, what you are looking then is quite reduced data, just the heat maps, kind of the condensation of gaze in a general area. But then if you look at the projection of all the things that are in the visual field in that area, there's a lot more going on in that general direction than just the tangent point. And how do you tease apart in field conditions or experiments all the different things that the driver could be looking at, rather than just jumping to the conclusion, okay, you got this stimulus here, and this is where they are looking, so that's what they must be looking at. However, in real world settings, there's always these confounds that you can't control, because there are bound to be other things in the world than just the one that's in your theory.
Yeah. No, I think that goes back to Alan's point. We have these kind of generalities. Good drivers look farther down the road, but there's obviously a lot more to it than that. And I think we're seeing that in some other domains in sports, right? The kind of some of the work on anchoring and pivot points. The idea that, like you're saying, Otto, what you're pointing your eyes at may not be what you're actually trying to see, right? That's just a convenient place to put your eyes to actually pick up what you want. Yeah. So,
and I just actually a review paper where I reviewed all the basics of gaze strategies on the road. What's known about gaze strategies that span the ecological spectrum. So gaze strategies that we see are actually physically happening in real world driving experiments, but also replicable in simple simulators. So I look at those kinds of behaviors. And in there, I raise this visual pivot versus anchoring distinction as one way to organize the literature and what's going on. So, and that brings me to racing driver, because in everyday driving, gaze seems to behave in this visual pivot manner, so that the apex of the bend or the tangent point region acts as the pivot, and then you have saccades going around doing kind of search-like patterns around, looking further ahead and returning to the pivot, looking at the instruments and returning to the pivot, and so on. That doesn't happen for the racing driver most of the time. The racing driver will just stare very far ahead, far beyond the tangent point region, and most of it is must be run from peripheral vision. And that's an interesting thing to me, then try to understand next better. So yes, you can do eye tracking in simulators or on the road, but the eye tracker just tells you where the gaze is located. It doesn't tell you why it's located there, and it doesn't tell you anything about the 99.99% of the rest of the visual field that's going to make a huge difference to your performance.
For sure. Yeah, no, that's really interesting. I did see it's in Frontiers, right? It just came out, I think, your paper. I saw
psychology.
that. Yeah, I haven't had a chance to read it yet, but I saw that. It sounds really interesting. And yeah, I think that's a kind of a message that comes through your book really well, is that you're not just summarizing a whole bunch of work that's already been done. You're also pointing out there's lots of opportunity here to understand and study this really interesting behavior. With a book, you kind of divide it into three sections. I like I love the way you did it. In the first one, you do what I always say, is the key to understanding thing, like a task analysis for first. Let's understand the skill first before we jump in and assume you need whatever, right? So Alan, can you tell us a little bit? You did some observing of drivers. Did you do some kind of maybe what are some of the key points that came out in understanding what makes a really skilled driver?
That's a complicated question, because
it is.
It's buried in ego. There's a lot of, like you imagine, I guess to make a reference to baseball and Moneyball, and you have the scene where I forget the name of the main character, Michael. I can't recall it, but when you have that situation where you have the old guys and they're going, "Oh, he cracks the bat. Listen to that," and so when you say what a skilled driver is, it takes me time to remove my own biases, mainly because I watched, say, Lewis Hamilton. I raced Lewis Hamilton as a kid, so I'm biased towards him because he was the most successful driver at the time. I then followed Max Verstappen, who's just as good, and part of the emotion is you want to see from a skilled driver, it's a motive. You're looking for aggression mainly, and this shapes the sport because the reason this question is more complex than it may appear is, unlike other sports, motorsport has a heavy financial element to it. So when you say what a skilled driver is, that's somewhat masked by the amount of financial power they have. So you have this huge element, which is the equipment itself, the engine and the chassis, which is part of the sport. Part of motorsport is a competition between engineers. So the question is equally, what makes a skilled engineer is just as valid in this environment. We can't detach the two. So when I watch a top level driver win, say Lewis Hamilton, when I watched him when he was 10 years old, okay? So he was on a zip car that was supplied by Martin Hines. He was on engines supplied by a man called John Davies. So that was all top end gear. So when the question is what is a skilled driver, I have to it's a challenge to remove all of that and to look at the bare driver, because you can't extricate the driver from the vehicles. I hope that just to give a bit of a preface. The reason that the book started was that was a question I couldn't really sufficiently answer. And we bring up chess in the book, and I think both Otto and I sort of reached a similar kind of thought on this separately, where driving seems to be more like a chess game than this kind of like we look at motorsport as dangerous and bravado and kind of rock and roll, but beneath it it's more sort of for want of a better word, geeky than people kind of realize. And generally speaking, good drivers tend to be very, very good at analyzing their own performances. This is like ubiquitous between all of them. But it's the ability to solve the puzzle of circulating the track at speed. Because if we approach a corner, on a very simple level, the question is, I want to get from A to B as quickly as possible. And that might mean if I take one corner that's a 90-degree right, you have to ask the question, do I go into that corner fast or do I go into it slow? If I go into it slow, I might be able to carry more speed out of the corner. It's a basic kind of formula. It's a calculation. And the best drivers in that sense can calculate, have a better way to calculate the consequences of their actions at various points in the corner. And in that, like a chess game, they make a move and they might be thinking 3 moves ahead, and that's generally speaking a very sort of layman's way to describe what I think a skilled driver is. But it's a complex question that is still something I struggle to answer today, because go on, Otto, you can continue. Yeah.
So well, there's 2 things here. So first of all, when Alan says that you are calculating, I know that Rob is going to have a hissy fit inside his brain, because of course we come from quite different theoretical camps. So is it direct perception of affordances, or is it some kind of calculation processes? I don't know. Nobody really knows. I think we agree where the interesting questions are, and I think we agree on the importance of looking at real world behavior. So trying to make your theoretical ideas do work in a real world environment. I wouldn't necessarily say applied, or at least this book is not applied as such, because it's not a how to drive book. It doesn't tell you how you should take a corner. There are excellent books on that by Keith Code and Ross Bentley and people, but this is about what we think of the processes that actually must be going on underneath, kind of beneath the hood. And we take a kind of a cognitive science, predictive processing approach to it, which is I would submit it's one way of looking at it. And I'm a big fan of your podcast, and actually when I was writing some of the stuff and preparing my cognitive basis of everyday and expert performance course about a year ago, I was binge listening to your podcast. So
I'm sorry.
No, it was great inspiration. So you might find some like familiar themes going on, especially in chapter 5. Then we move to the predictive processing in chapter 6 and 7, so we may lose you. But the underlying phenomena, I think, are there. So
yeah, for sure. I think, and you know, I definitely, I think, you know, the steering and optic flow, there's obviously some basis, but one of the things, you know, I know kind of in the next start, when you get into the more specifics, one of the things I'll admit is a real challenge to explain if you really want to go to a direct perception ecological view is the role drivers' knowledge and previewing and things like that of the course. What did did you find out about that, Otto, and the importance of that, and how far are we understanding how that's used?
Well, we are not where we'd like to be. So I think one of the main points is that knowledge of the track layout and what people often refer to as a cognitive map. I don't particularly like that term actually, and I think, but it's a metaphor, so you shouldn't take it very literally. But the driver's knowledge of the track layout is much bigger part of the skill of taking a corner than people possibly realize. So it's not that, okay, you see the track there and you make an instant judgment. You can't drive a racing car at full speed on a track competitively based on just appearances. You have to know the track, and people practice the lap, as Alan referred to earlier, that you take a person, you make them practice a lap, they will build some kind of knowledge of the track into their brain, and that's a huge part. That's the top level, the kind of navigational properties of the skill of driving very fast, which are not very well understood. I actually have a theoretical paper on those coming up right now, so it was just accepted last week. So there I go into more detail about into this hierarchy where you have this navigational aspect, which people possibly don't recognize until it's pointed to them as kind of the foundation of the skill. And then you have the preview and the visual guidance, and then you have the car control at the very bottom, and they all need to be aligned and integrated. And the higher level processes are probably, I would submit, more kind of recyclable between different tasks, different vehicles, certainly, and even different sports. So racing drivers tend to be pretty good at getting getting handy with any kind of equipment or skiing or whatever, because you are developing the same kinds of skills, I think. And these are all still like just the skill of going very fast. So your question was really what makes a skilled racing driver. So as Alan said, there's a huge amount of complexity on top of all of that. So there's the money game, there's the team building. You have to make people want to work for you. You have to find the right people to work with. You have to have to develop your career. All these things that are in complex competitive environments in established sports or in the academia, indeed, where you have to have all these skills. It's not enough just to be clever, and you don't necessarily have to be the cleverest person to succeed in academia. It's just a fundamental basic skill, and then there's all these other aspects. And what we write about here is the cognitive basis of that fundamental basic skill, not all the things that you need to be a good driver or let alone a successful driver.
Yeah,
I'd like to just quickly add to that very quickly, and I sort of we touch upon it in the epilogue a little bit. The reason the question it throws me a bit, because I'm conscious that your listeners will be aware of Max Verstappen, Lewis Hamilton, you know, maybe some of the IndyCar drivers, and if your listeners in America and NASCAR. motorsport is kind of funky in a way, because in terms of, if we look at it purely from a scientific point of view and say a highly skilled driver, you don't necessarily look fundamentally at the most successful drivers. So I have, for example, a kart club near me, and the drivers winning my local kart club race, some of them on a very sort of fundamental way of navigating a circuit at speed at an elite level, aren't any different to guys in F1 or guys in IndyCar and NASCAR. They just didn't have the funds to get to the top. So when we ask, the question throws me when it says highly skilled, is because it's very difficult. In other sports, we can look at the top baseball players and say those are the top baseball players with a decent amount of security in saying that. And in like football, you can have a decent confidence that the best NFL player or the best NHL, they're going to be at the elite, and that's going to be. But motorsport doesn't quite work like that. And at the end of the book, I talk about Schumacher racing at the Supernats in Las Vegas, and the guy that won it is actually deaf. Funnily enough, that's interesting if you're studying hearing. He won. He's a guy called Baz Lammers, and at the time, this was 2009. He was a phenomenally talented driver, and he was racing up against Marco Ardigo, the local driver Gary Colton, and Schumacher's like struggling to get in the top 10. So Schumacher is the greatest driver of all time, but there were other drivers there in karts. They had different vehicles, but they're still racing vehicles, who were just flat out quicker. So the question of what is a highly skilled driver is difficult to deconstruct, because I'm not presented with these are the top 20 drivers in the world and I can compare them very easily like you can with other sports. Like the best baseball players play the best baseball players, and from that you can form your theories because you can observe. But in motorsport, I'm equally confident to say I know drivers that I know who do local club races who are just as, air quotes here, talented, because that term's a bit murky, as some of the top level drivers in Formula One. And it's not a controversial thing to say, it's just a reality of motorsport. But what this does do in terms of study, and this extends into sim drivers as well, because you've got motorsport is very strange that we've got this middle ground now of sim. You've got interest, people that watch it, then you've got sim drivers, and then you've got real life drivers. And sim drivers, there's thousands of them, and they're equally as highly skilled. So in a sense, while it's difficult to describe what a highly skilled driver really is, because comparisons are quite difficult due to the fragmented nature of motorsport, at the same time, if you take sim racing and other racing that's more accessible, you've actually got a breadth of competitors who are competing at a very, very high level that can provide a substantial database for anybody interested in observing high-level drivers. If you just remove your gaze, for want of a better word, from maybe the sort of perceived top echelons of the sport. I hope that makes sense. My answer isn't as clear, but this is why I wanted to get involved in the book project and get the book project started, because we wanted to expand, have a foundation of theory of how the skill, the foundation of the driving skill, to then pinpoint really what elite drivers are very good at, because that's the big question, as it is for any sport.
Yeah, no, I think those are great points. You definitely, it's a more complex answer because of the environment, the vehicle, right? It's a big system, right? I think is a good point. One of the things, getting into specifics of the skill, one of the things that kind of fascinates, obviously there's a big planning component and you have to have a strategy or plan, but one of the things that fascinates me about driving must be an enormous recalibration when driving, right? The weight of the vehicle is changing, your tires changing, the track is changing, all the while, like you cannot do the same exact things all the way around. You're constantly, the constraints and the relationship between you, the vehicle, and the environments change. So how much do we know about that kind of, the feel or whatever you would want to call it, the adjustments a driver has to make? How much do we know about that kind of thing, Otto?
Well, the word feel referring to being sensitive to what the car is doing. And it's not just like sensory level sensitivity, that how acute is your sense of touch, or how precise is your sense of inner rear balance, although those may come into it, but it's more nuanced than that, because when you talk about feel, you're really talking about how you feel what the car is doing dynamically and what it wants you to do, as it were. And then on the control side, you want often the word smooth is used. So you want your outputs based on your feel to be smooth and consistent and not surprise the vehicle, as it were. And those are kind of the bedrock foundation that people presumably develop when they start karting at a very young age. Although sim racers are an interesting bunch in this respect, because they don't have those physical sensations and opportunity to develop that kind of feel, but they can develop the visual guidance and track reading and the navigational skills, and then be able to drive at a very high level. So I'd say that that bedrock of feel is quite a mystery at the moment, and I think that's also where I can appreciate the more Gibsonian. I won't say ecological, because I think you can be a cognitive predictive processing guy and still do work that's ecological in a broader sense. But I'd say that's where like these invariants and affordances and where's the variation, where are the invariants, that kind of thing is more relevant. But I think it's quite it's not very well understood, but there's huge potential there, I feel, because of this fact that I alluded to before, that you can understand the vehicle, you can get precise telemetry, and you can try to understand the differences, even at high level of skill where the differences are quite subtle. You can try to understand them at a more precise level. But yeah, if you go to the top elite level, so we had on our website, we do these interviews with people from motorsport. So Ben Edwards, he talked about how he'd been talking to Formula One, like a chief engineer, or I don't remember what the title is, and they go like, okay, we can look at all the telemetry, and we can look where they're braking, or we can look at how they are getting off the brakes, and we still can't quite understand why one of them is 500ths of a second faster through this bend than the other guy. And those are the kind of tiny differences that you're looking at there. So at that level of detail, it's quite subtle and would be interesting to understand more. Coming at it from a cognitive science and from a visual guidance and eye tracking perspective, we kind of build up towards this question of feel and control. So we start with the navigational elements and the kind of mental images and cognitive maps and other metaphors, and then work towards the details of the feel and smooth control. But we don't get there yet all the way, because nobody knows it yet. It's too subtle.
Yeah, no, definitely, it's a challenging question, and I think that's a really interesting way to go with it and stuff.
I just want to add in
Alan,
interjection there. In terms of feel, like there's a linguistic inadequacy, I guess, in a lot of things, in trying to describe things. Like I'm a musician, and it's hard to. I think I say in the book, kind of a little anecdote. Someone was trying to get funding for a music project they had, and they were asked to describe what the music project was about and what the music meant. And he said, if I could write it down, it would have no value. And in a sense, in driving, I mean, we talk about this in the book, is linguistically, there's some limitations in trying to describe. It's like I just thought of it. If you're if you're wrestling someone, and I think most people can imagine wrestling someone and you're pushing against them, it's very difficult to describe the other person in where their weight is and how they feel. If you're wrestling, it's like it's something it's hard to actually have the vocabulary to describe. And in the car, it's very similar. And what you'll see is a lot of hand gestures to describe various behaviors. And you notice you term like behavior, like the car has a behavior. It's like it's its own animal, So you'll see a lot of drivers and you can, they'll make loads of hand gestures, and it's particularly evident in motorbike racing, because we were sort of talking more about four-wheel racing here, but it's very evident in motorbike racing. You'll see them. You'll see one of the most common one is they'll look like their hands on handlebars and they'll shake like that. They'll shake their hands, and usually that's to describe something called front end chatter, or they'll move their body about, or they'll make sounds with their mouth. And I know from a scientific point of view, it's very difficult to study.
Yes.
How do you collect data of drivers? And sorry for your listeners, you'll hear them say they'll go blah, 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 and it's like they'll use sounds rather than just words to describe what feel means. And in addition to this, and it refers back to highly skilled drivers, but feel as well. There's a lot of there's quite often idiosyncrasies between drivers. For example, Senna had a throttle technique which was particularly unique. So he stabbed, like most sports, is the most common thing you hear is you've got to be smooth. It's all about smoothness, and he was anything but smoothness, smooth on the throttle. He wasn't erratic, because in the end, we talk about possibility of like a low pass filter and that kind of stuff, but he used to stamp the throttle, and he was asked about it, and he said he didn't know why he did it. But it was a very unique thing. Schumacher used to drag the throttle on the brakes, which is a big no-no. Like the two best drivers of all time have two, in a sense, technical flaws, So each driver interacts with the vehicle in their own specific way, and this is not uncommon. It's the same for everybody, whether it be music, baseball. Everyone feels the weight of the bat differently, and how they learned to do it when they started probably informs how they their relationship with the object later on. But motorsport, because the vehicle is so dynamic, you sort of veer into the world of language of emotion. And I'm reading Adrian Newey's book at the moment, and there's always work like the car was nasty, or it was, it wasn't nice. This is a relationship type language. So I can't talk about it from a cognitive science perspective, because I don't have the credentials in it. I'm just a guy that teaches people how to drive. But the complexities of feel, we're still at that stage of it's a bit wishy-washy, So hopefully with the book we break down the actual components. But it's still a question that is open to a lot of discussion, and hopefully we have more discussions like this.
Yeah, no, I think Alan, those are great points about the difficulty of language, and I think that's the way we have to learn about these things, both these kind of observations and the scientific approach to it, because they're both valid. I think.
I would like to add one more thing.
Sure.
Sorry to veer off, because I think it'll be valuable, because I listen to a lot of what you spoke about, and a lot of what you talk about is practice design, and this is all about skill acquisition. So in terms of practice design in motorsport, it's very difficult to construct practice design. So let's take Formula One. You've only got 20 Formula One cars in the entire world. There's a new car every single year. So there's a new if there's a big regulatory change, the cars change a lot, like they have this year. So and the testing is limited. So they can only test for 6 days prior to the season. Each driver gets 3 days each. There is no way that they can practice their sport as you can in other sports. So this informs us about the way that drivers acquire their skills. And as young drivers, we tend to coach drivers in a very formula. They do laps and they get better, and you might work on one aspect of your driving. It's not like you can often we'll say we're going to concentrate on one aspect of your driving today, and it's braking, and you'll focus on one corner, but they're still driving the rest of the lap to get to the point where you're focusing. Whereas if you're doing an isolation training practice design, you can go, right, we're just going to bring it right into this aspect, if that's your chosen choice of practice design, and you can repeat that over and over again. But in motorsport, it's very, we don't often have very constructed practice methods. It's very sort of not, I don't, what I'm saying is, I'm not saying that people don't do this. It's just what I've observed. It's just, and a lot of drivers up until they're 14, 15, there's not, it's basically parents are teaching, or there's not a huge coaching base that is very invested in this practice design. So I thought that would be interesting to talk about in motocross and supercross, which is dirt bike riding, where the difference between the riders is more abrupt. There's significant differences between the best riders and the worst. So coaching tends to yield more, or good practice tends to yield more benefit. And you have guys like Aldon Baker, who has a training facility. So in that realm, because obviously motorsport is vast in its variance, it's like baseball in United Kingdom is the same as it is in America. It's baseball. But in motorsport, we've got, you might have baseball, you might have cricket, bat and ball sports. But in motorsport, we have like 100 different variations.
Yeah.
So bikes tend to be more geared towards practice design, specifically dirt bikes, whereas my realm is a bit more wishy-washy. And I just thought it would it's just an interest to you, because you sort of do a lot of work in practice design that we don't. And then, I mean, I haven't seen much of it, but we don't really have much of it like that. It just tends to be laps. Is do a lot of laps and get someone who's good to point out your mistakes. But it's the practice design tends to inform us of the level of investment there has been in studying the skill and the feel. Yeah, that makes sense.
No, for sure.
So because we don't have it in motorsport, we haven't got the study. We don't have the practice design, which tends to inform us that the study in what the skill is and what feel isn't there. If that makes sense, I hope I'm making sense.
No, for sure. Obviously, you have a safety element, and there's a lot of constraints around practice in driving.
And cost.
And the cost,
hugely
for sure.
expensive, and like getting the opportunity to practice is a question of its own. But on a kind of more theoretical level, the question of language and the role of language in skill development and skill execution is interesting in its own right. So I think in your book, Rob, you have this quote that the body has very little interest in what the coach has to say.
That's Franz Bosch's one, to be fair. Yes. It's
a quote. So when you're writing a book, you have to put everything into words and pictures. We use a lot of pictures, but you have to put things into words. And these base level skills, the feel and the smoothness or lack of it, the right kind of lack of it, if you will, these are at the unconscious level, and the kids learning to kart, they just absorb this, and then it becomes part of who you are and how you see the world. So it becomes very difficult to put into words. So that's where you need science ultimately, because science needs to put everything ultimately into numbers. So we are just trying to put things into words here, but then you need to go and put into numbers ultimately to be able to understand it scientifically. And to supplement the limits of spoken language when you need to communicate, when a racing driver has to communicate with other racing drivers or engineers, then they will use all these hand gestures and sound effects. And that's kind of an interesting object of study in itself. So how is this form of communication? How does it work? What kinds of expressions are used? This we don't look at really, because we are looking at the skill of driving. Again, like one of the boundaries, we just look at the core skill, the pure skill of driving very fast. And then there's all these other skills that you also need. And yeah, and we make a big point in many places about the limits of language and how the skill part of your brain doesn't really know what the thinking and talking part is doing. But that's not entirely accurate ultimately, because you can coach somebody, you can point out their errors. And I'm from Finland, so I'm not just about Formula One and track driving, but also somewhat partial to rally driving. And in rally driving, you have the co-driver reading the pace notes that they have prepared on the recce and reading 2, 3, 4 corners ahead. All the stuff you can't see, they are reading out the pace notes for the corners that will be coming up. And if you look at skilled rally drivers in-car footage and try to keep up of where the co-driver is, he or she is reading the road. They are looking at the pace notes. They are not looking out the window, because they have to look at the pace notes. They are feeling the car move. They need to figure out where they are in the pace notes, read out the pace note at the correct time. The driver has to take in this verbal information about 2 or 3 corners ahead while they are looking at the next corner and controlling the car in this corner. So if you look at it from first principles, like, it's such cognitive acrobatics that you would think, okay, this is not possible. That is not something humans should be able to do. But then you put a 16, 17-year-old kid into a rally car like Kalle Rovapera, and they just go. So it's a huge, interesting, fascinating bunch of subjects that we need to understand.
Yeah. That's the biggest thing that I get from reading it, is how much there is to it. I think everyone knows a little bit, about previewing the course and everything, but the detail, of what's involved, you really appreciate the skill even more after you read it. So maybe we'll wrap up here, guys. Al, so the book is called The Science of the Racer's Brain. I have my copy right here. Alan, can you tell if people are, want to find out more about it, order it, where should they go?
You should go on Amazon and search it on Amazon, The Science of the Racer's Brain, and there's you've got a paperback copy, hardback, and ebook. The website is racersbrain.org. There's some sample material in there. There's also interviews. So we spoke to a guy called Ben Edwards. So Ben Edwards was he's been a Formula One commentator for years. He's one of the best in the business. Corinne Chandhok, who works for Sky as a commentator and a pundit, but he also raced in F1. We spoke to Mark Hales as well, who's he's like one of the best known car journalists in the UK, and he coaches drivers, races himself, top level. And so we're just hoping to, and also check us out on YouTube. So if you look up The Science of the Racer's Brain on YouTube, Otto's got some sort of 180-second videos, sort of short bursts that I think it's about eight or how many videos? Was it 8 videos or so?
Oh, cool.
I think 7. So it's in total about 15 minutes viewing time. So if you want to get the quick lowdown on what kinds of themes there are with pictures and words, then those will give you a quick idea of some of the main themes in the book.
Oh, cool. I'll definitely have a look at that.
We hope with it. Sorry, just to say that one of the main sort of things for the book, for me anyway, is like we've already just said, it gives people a greater appreciation of the skill involved and the sort of the monumental feat. It's like anything that humans do. And I guess if you ever watch something like the Isle of Man TT, I don't know if you've ever seen it yourself.
No.
I suggest look up Isle of Man TT on board. And once you read the book and you know how amazing it is for someone to circulate just a 3-mile circuit, you watch that and it's people riding a motorbike at 200 miles an hour on the streets of the Isle of Man. And the lap is like, I can't recall, it's 35 miles or something ridiculous. And they lap it.
Yeah, and it's on modern superbikes, and it's a public road through village. It's crazy. So Ernest Hemingway is reputed to have said that there's really only three sports. There's mountaineering, bullfighting, and motorsport. Now that's apocryphal. I don't think Hemingway said that, but anyway, it's a good quote. And I don't know about the current status of bullfighting nowadays or mountaineering. Most of motorsport has lost some of that Hemingway-esque
it's more
danger element, but with the speed of modern bikes and tires, the TT just takes
at the pinnacle,
the next level. It just keeps going. So it's it has all those elements also, which we don't. We take a cognitive perspective and look at the brain function and how the skill is put together and so on. But when you go and look at what they do, what those guys and girls do, then you just have to go, wow. And that's
well, I'll definitely check that. So thank you, Otto and Alan. That was great. And as I said, I'm not a racing fan at all, and I really enjoyed reading it. I thought it was really, really fascinating, understanding that the skill.
Nice to hear. We try to write in a way that people who are not racing fans also can appreciate it and get something out of it. So we don't presume any familiarity or interest in racing, or any familiarity with brain science or cognitive science either. For non-academic people, it's also a gentle introduction to the science.
For sure. Yeah, knowing that too as well. Yeah. Okay, great. Thanks, guys. Okay, that's it for today's episode. Remember, you can contact me at robgray@asu.edu or follow me on Twitter at ShakyWeights. To find out more about the podcast, please check out perceptionaction.com. Finally, to support the podcast and receive bonus materials, including written transcripts, please head over to patreon.com/perceptionaction. This is Rob Gray from ASU. Cheers for now, and keep 'em coupled. Gone straight away.